On January 7, 1948, a United States Air Force pilot named Thomas Mantell would perish after chasing an unidentified flying object in the sky. Captain Thomas Mantell was a World War II hero and an experienced pilot. While the military would conclude that Mantell died from oxygen deprivation, many that day, including hundreds of civilians, would report seeing a UFO. Since then, many have questioned what happened that day. In this episode, we will examine the Thomas Mantell incident. At 1:20 p.m. on January 7th, 1948, the control tower at Godman Field Army Air Force Base, located in Fort Knox, would spot an unidentified flying object getting close to the base. During this time, Thomas Mantell was doing routine training around the base area. He was leading 4 P-51 fighters on the mission. In the control tower, it wasn't clear what the object was, and many began speculating. Soon, senior officials were called, and the control tower decided to have Mantell and others investigate. Sometime before 2:45 p.m., Mantell would receive the orders to investigate the unknown object. Mantell confirmed and began heading that direction. In a short time, with Mantell leading, the group would ascend to 15,000 feet. While Captain Mantell and the 3 planes began heading toward the coordinates of the craft, only Captain Mantell would end up chasing the object and getting close. The first plane would break away as it needed to refuel. In the second plane, the pilot believed he was going to get lost as his plane wasn't equipped to fly at high altitudes. He asked to return to base, and Mantell allowed him. Mantell would ask the third plane to join the second to ensure a safe return. At this point, a solo Mantell pursued the craft. Mantell kept ascending and soon radioed the tower that he had a visual on the object. He stated, "It appears to be a metallic object, or possible reflections of sun from a metallic object, and it is of tremendous size. I'm still climbing. The object is above and ahead of me, moving at my speed or faster. I'm trying to close in for a better look." Mantell continued pursuing the craft, and around 3:30 stated that he would fly around 10 more minutes to 25,000 feet. At 3:50, the tower lost visual of the object. Around 4 to 4:30 p.m., the tower would receive a few gargled messages from Thomas Mantell. They have been described as indecipherable over the years, but some say he communicated back he saw beings in the craft. Sometime around 4 to 5 p.m., more reports started to surface from non-civilians around a UFO in the sky. At 5 p.m., it was discovered that Mantell had crashed, and this is where the mystery begins. What happened to Captain Thomas Mantell in those final minutes has been a hotly debated topic. The United States Air Force would report that as he climbed to 25,000 feet, Mantell would pass out. The report concludes that the plane went to 30,000 feet before suddenly plunging straight down. It is believed that he never regained consciousness during the ordeal, as debris showed no attempt to abandon the plane. The United States Air Force also stated that the UFO certainly did not cause the crash. However, many question the report for several reasons. First is that numerous witnesses saw the UFO sometime before Mantell crashed his plane. Kentucky residents began calling Kentucky State Police offices in the morning, and calls happened throughout the early afternoon. So many were received, in fact, that Fort Knox military was notified. In a January 6, 2005 article by Tourette editor Larry Barnes, he wrote that at least several hundred people had called in the UFO by 1:15 p.m. In addition, he noted how clear and calm the weather was, with visibility for at least 10 miles. In addition to the 100 of non-military who saw the craft, several military officers at the base described what they saw. Quentin Blackwell and Stanley Oliver would, like many eyewitnesses, describe the object as an upside-down ice cream cone. One other witness was Operations Officer Gary Carter. He said the object was plainly visible in the afternoon sky. One other witness was Captain James F. Dwesler, who was second in command on the base that day. He reported on the day of the crash, he was asked to go to the control tower. When he arrived, he was directed to look out in the sky. There, he would see a shiny silver object hovering in the sky. It had the shape of an upside-down ice cream cone. The largest part pointed toward the ground, and the narrow part toward the sky. It looked like it was rotating and had a black line running top to bottom and was reddish toward the bottom. There's still many questions surrounding the events that day. For one, what was Captain Mantell chasing? And also, what did everyone see? While the military report seems very dismissive of the UFO, the fact is many civilians and military saw something. There have been several hypotheses around what the object was. One is that they saw a skyhook balloon. In the 1940s and 1950s, under a top-secret program, the U.S. was developing high-altitude balloons that came to be known as skyhook balloons. It's said Captain Mantell wouldn't have been aware of these. While some have suggested this, others disagree adamantly. For one, there were hundreds of witnesses that spotted the object, and many were able to give detailed descriptions. These descriptions didn't align with what a skyhook balloon looks like. Balloons have a long history being associated with UFOs. Around 6 months earlier, in 1947, the most famous UFO case in human history occurred in Roswell, New Mexico. As many reports began to surface around a UFO crash, the government would soon attribute the strange object to be a balloon. While there have been balloons mistaken for UFOs, this case is very unique in that both military personnel, who would easily be able to ID a balloon, and civilians spotted a strange object in the sky. One question concerning the balloon theory is, why would a top-secret project be testing so close to civilians and also near the control tower? Some have argued that it flew off course, but wouldn't have Fort Knox been notified? Some have speculated the object was actually the planet Venus. Over the years, this theory has become less popular, though. Another theory, of course, is that the object was a UFO. There's many reasons to believe this is a strong possibility. The large number of witnesses, including people in the control tower, witnesses on the ground, and Mantell himself, noted the object was flying at least as fast as him. Mantell had logged over 2,500 hours of flight time and surely would know a balloon could not travel that fast. The final question concerns the crash. Did the UFO attack the captain? Many have speculated that it did. It's important to point out that the military kept much of this event as classified, so even if this did happen, it most likely would have never came to light. The captain was surely a skilled pilot, and we've seen cases like this as well. Frederick Valentich was a pilot who witnessed a UFO and soon after perished. The event wasn't helped by the fact that the government was very dismissive of UFOs at the time. Without question, much of the event and investigation around the crash has not been made public. This eliminates the possibility of having independent analysis done on the crash. Even if the UFO didn't attack and crash Mantell's plane, it's very probable that something was in the sky that day, something that wasn't a balloon. On August 29th, 1967, around 10:30 a.m., two children in Cusack, France, would experience a close encounter of the third kind. Francois Delpouche, age 11, and his sister, Anne-Marie, age 9, were out in the pasture, tending to their family's cattle, when they would see what appeared to be children. However, as they moved closer and got a better look, it was evident these humanoids were anything but. In today's episode, we will examine the 1967 Cusack encounter. August 29th, 1967 was a clear and sunny day in the village of Cusack. By all accounts, up until this day, no strange activity or sightings had occurred in the area. However, that would soon change. As Francois was directing the cattle, he would turn around and spot something across the road in the distance. They were around 120 feet away and behind a low rock wall and some trees and bushes. At first, Francois believed they were other children, so he began looking more closely through the shrubs. Quickly, though, he concluded this was something strange. Anne-Marie climbed on the wall as well, and soon the two would look on in amazement at something truly extraordinary. As the two looked on, they viewed a bright orb around 6 feet in diameter. It appeared to have a silver undertone, although it was bright and tough to see. There were 3 legs underneath it, lifting it a few feet off the ground. There were 4 beings, all of different sizes, and all appearing shiny black. It's not clear if these were suits or just how the alien's skin looked. The children couldn't see any features on the beings, though. The children spotted the beings doing different things. One of them appeared to be bending over, collecting soil samples. Another being was holding a reflective type of device and waving it, possibly signaling to the others. The other 2 were walking around as if they were exploring the terrain. A confused Francois then yelled to the beings, "Have you come to play with us?" At this time, the beings, most likely unaware that they were being watched, realized that they now had been seen. Suddenly, one of the beings levitated off the ground and went head first into the top of the spear. It was followed in a similar fashion by the second and third beings. The craft then began to rise, even though one of the entities was not in it. The landing gear appeared to just disappear, although Anne-Marie would later say it may have just been too bright to see it. The craft had risen around 50 feet in the air and began moving away. The being holding the reflective device appeared to drop it. After picking it up, the entity started running after the orb. Once it got underneath, it dove head first into the bright orb, as the others had did. As the craft began to rise higher, it became brighter and stopped. Then suddenly it shot off quickly to the northwest. Right after this happened, a sulfur smell soon reached the children and the other animals. Both the cattle and the dog were very agitated and anxious for some time. The children would tell their father, who went and got the police. At the scene, the police would confirm in their police report the smell of sulfur and dried grass as well, where the children said the craft took off. After the sighting, Francois' eyes would hurt for some time. For days after he woke up, his eyes were watering. Anne-Marie didn't experience this side effect, though. After the event, the children were interviewed by UFO investigators Joel Mesnard and Claude Pavey. Both investigators noted they questioned Anne-Marie with continuous questions, trying to uncover inconsistencies. She appeared somewhat shy, but was consistent in her answers. After interviewing her, they questioned Francois. Both stories aligned. In March 2007, France released a number of UFO documents on their government website. The site crashed the first few hours it was released due to a high volume of web traffic, but this case was one of several that stood out for being so credible. UFO cases with children are often some of the most compelling, as it's difficult to imagine that children could stand up to the rigorous questioning. Some of the most credible UFO cases, such as the Zimbabwe aerial school incident, reflect this. In that case, dozens of students and a teacher had a close encounter of the third kind in the year 1994. Decades later, all the witnesses remain adamant about their experience to that day. While children are certainly capable of lying or exaggerating, it seems that an adult is much more likely to fool an investigator. By all accounts, it seems that this was the only sighting in the area. It seems that both Francois and Anne-Marie didn't experience any other negative side effects and were able to go on and live normal lives. On October 4th, 1967, one of the most famous and well-documented UFO sightings in the history of Canada occurred. In the small fishing village of Shag Harbor, located on the south shore of Nova Scotia, Canada, multiple independent witnesses would see a series of strange lights over the bay. In this episode, we will explore one of Canada's best-known UFO sightings, an event that came to be known as the Shag Harbor Incident. On October 4th, 1967, several hours before the residents of Shag Harbor would spot the unidentified lights in the sky, others would report strange activity in the skies as well. At 7:15, Air Canada Flight 305 was flying over the area of Saint-Jean, Quebec, which is around 475 miles away from Shag Harbor. In flight, two individuals would report seeing something strange in the air. Captain Pierre Charbonneau and First Officer Robert Ralph saw an unknown object outside the left window that was tracking with them. The captain described the craft as very bright and rectangular, with a string of smaller lights following behind it. At 7:21 p.m., there was some sort of quiet explosion which engulfed the craft in a blue cloud, and then it disappeared. Halifax Harbor, around 150 miles northwest of Shag Harbor, would report strange lights in the sky as well. Around 10 p.m., local radio stations, the police, and newspapers started getting flooded with calls from residents seeing strange lights flying throughout the area. Then, an hour later or so, just after 11 p.m. local time, a group of Shag Harbor residents would spot a series of strange orange lights over the harbor. There were 4 orange lights over the water around 800 feet away, or somewhere around the vicinity of half a mile. The lights would flash in random patterns for a few minutes and then suddenly dashed straight toward the water. The lights of the craft appeared to be either right on the surface or just underneath it. Still, the lights didn't vanish completely, as evidenced by dozens of witness reports. Many of the witnesses believed at this point it was a plane that had crashed in the water. During this time, a fisherman called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Barrington to report the incident. Within the next 10 minutes, the station started receiving dozens of phone calls. That night, there were already several constables on patrol in the area. Constable Ron Pound was in the area and saw the strange lights over Shag Harbor. Once he spotted them, he started heading closer. As he arrived at the shore, he met with other constables, police officers, and witnesses. The group was confused and debated what to do next and who to call. As this was occurring, the 4 lights on the craft changed from orange to yellow and it began moving away further from the shore and leaving some type of yellow foam on the surface. At least 30 residents witnessed the event, and they described the craft as being 60 feet with 4 lights, around 10 feet tall, and having a dome shape. The craft began sinking at this point, and witnesses then reported hearing a whistling sound similar to a bomb. This was followed by a whooshing sound, and lastly, a loud bang. As they believed it was an airline accident at this point, fishermen and police hopped on their boats so that they could rescue any survivors. At this time, the Coast Guard had already been contacted and were on their way. As they arrived, the light was nowhere to be found, but there was a strange yellow foam on the surface of the water. It looked like sea foam, but clearly wasn't. No one, including the elder fishermen, knew what the substance was. The boats continued sailing through the water and the strange foam, but found no wreckage nor any people. Around 3 a.m., the search ended. Several air traffic control centers were contacted, and there would be no reports of missing aircraft in the vicinity that day. On October 5th, a Canadian Navy ship called the HMCS Granby arrived in the area. This naval ship was equipped with advanced systems that locate debris. The ship also had specially trained drivers who could search the sea floor. For several days they looked, but found nothing. For years, no new significant developments would occur in the case, until the year 1993. Then 2 investigators, Chris Stiles and Doug Ledge, would uncover some fascinating information. After speaking with witnesses, military and ex-military, it was determined the object had been tracked by the United States Navy. After the craft disappeared, it traveled around 25 miles near a U.S. military base at Government Point. The purpose of this base was for tracking submarines in the North Atlantic Ocean. As the object arrived in the waters near Government Point, it stopped and held its position for 3 days. The U.S. Navy arrived and positioned several ships over the object. Not knowing what the object was, the Navy didn't engage. The Navy would soon discover something interesting. Another craft came in along with the other object. It is thought this craft came to help the original one. Still unsure what to do, the Navy waited for 7 days on top of the objects. After 7 days, a Russian sub was detected in the North Atlantic and several ships had to be relocated. While this was happening, the 2 crafts moved away and traveled toward the Gulf of Maine. As the Navy followed the crafts with a few vessels, they easily moved further and further away. At some point, at a good distance, the crafts rose up from the surface of the water and flew away at lightning speeds. As mentioned, this is quite a popular case from Canada. It seems to be relatively unknown outside the country, though. The case features unidentified submersible objects, or USOs. This type of unexplained phenomena has gained a lot of attention in past years, as there have been several cases involving them. Many believe that extraterrestrials live, or at the very least hide, in the deep parts of the ocean. It's documented as well that several sonar readings from the military have picked up strange activity in the ocean. On some cases, objects picked up have been reported traveling thousands of miles per hour under the surface of the water. In the 1990s, as this case was re-examined, all the witnesses remained steadfast in their stories. In addition, the ufologists were able to speak with several military officers who witnessed the event. Most had to remain anonymous due to fear of losing their pension. One interesting fact in the case concerns the strange yellow foam on the water. It's not clear to this day what it was or what could have caused it. No sample was collected. Was this regular sea foam, that was somehow altered by the object? Or was this a substance given off by the craft? This continues to be a solid UFO case to this day. There was never any sort of wreckage found on the floor of the ocean, which wasn't that deep as well. With multiple independent witnesses and much documentation on the event, it is one that adds support to the belief that extraterrestrials are visiting our planet. One final point is that most believe that the lights or what had crashed in the sea was an airline crash. This adds validity to the case, since there's really no doubt that something was seen by many independent witnesses on that night. In 1954 in Italy, there were numerous reports of UFOs around the country. Perhaps, though, the most notable was what happened in Florence in the Tuscany region at a soccer match on October 27, 1954. While UFO sightings with multiple people are considered somewhat rare, this case is truly unique due to the large number of witnesses. That day, in broad daylight, tens of thousands of soccer fans would see several strange crafts hover over the soccer stadium. The event drew massive media attention and is one of the most witnessed UFO events in history. In today's episode, we will examine what happened at this Italian soccer match in 1954, as well as the strange white material that the UFOs released. On a crisp autumn day in October 1954, the popular Fiorentina club was playing against its rival Pistoiese in the Stadio Artemi Franchi in Florence. Sometime just after halftime, around 2:20 p.m., the boisterous crowd fell into an almost deafening silence. A few moments later, a loud roar came from across the fans. People began pointing to the sky, and soon the players, initially confused, looked up and the soccer game stopped altogether. Up in the sky, there were several large, egg-shaped UFOs that were quietly, slowly hovering just over the stadium. The objects had a silverish color, and soon a strange white glitter would begin to fall from the sky. Later in the episode, we will discuss this strange white substance in more detail. Players and fans would recall these events years later. Gigi Boni, a fan, remembers that day clearly and described the objects as more like a Cuban cigar than egg-shaped. He noted the UFOs flew in very fast and suddenly stopped. Then for several minutes, they flew around the stadium very slowly. In the days that followed, newspapers picked up on the event and it became a national story. In addition to this mass sighting though, UFOs were seen around Tuscany that day by many. Even more interesting is UFO sightings continued for several days in the Tuscany region. While descriptions of the objects have differed slightly, there's a variety of eyewitness reports that show something was in the sky that day. The match report even shows that the game was suspended due to the sighting. Perhaps one of the more interesting things that occurred that day was the white substance that fell from the sky. Known as angel hair, this white, unknown substance has fallen in multiple places where UFOs have been spotted for decades. The day the UFO was seen, the white angel hair would appear all over homes in Florence. One interesting story concerns what journalist Gregorio Bettini recalled seeing that day. According to Bettini, he began receiving hundreds of calls about the UFO sightings on October 27, 1954. Working at a newspaper called La Nazione, Bettini ran on the roof and would witness what he described as shiny balls flying quickly down from the sky. Bettini would rush downstairs and collect a sample in a jar, careful not to touch it. He, along with everyone else, would soon discover that this white substance was very hard to collect. For most, any contact with the angel hair, and it disintegrated on contact. One 10-year-old boy recalls seeing the substance on all the roofs of the homes. Around an hour later, it was gone, as if it had evaporated into the sky. In 1952, in Oloron, France, many reported seeing over 30 red, spherical UFOs flying in the sky. From the crafts, a white substance fell all over the city. Like the Florence strange white substance, this material seemed to vanish when people tried to collect it. One man even stated he got trapped by it and couldn't move. It then released him, and he saw it rise up into the sky. Just 10 days later, in Gaillac, France, the same strange white substance fell again. There's been much debate as to what this substance was. It should be noted, as difficult as the material was to collect, it was able to be tested by a renowned Italian scientist, Giovanni Caneri. He performed spectrographic analysis and concluded that it contained the elements boron, silicon, calcium, and magnesium. Also, he found that it was not radioactive. Of course, this raised even more questions than answers, and the material vanished right after his testing. Skeptics say that the white angel hair is actually from spiders. The migrating spider theory says that spiders use these webs as sails and move very high up in the sky. October is the time of year when they do this behavior, but many scoff at the notion that this was simply spider silk. For one, spider silk doesn't contain all the elements, boron, silicon, calcium, or magnesium, which were found in the testing. Many believe this is a lazy way to explain it. It's also important to point out that in many cases where this angel hair was seen, a large number of witnesses reported seeing UFOs. Coming back to the soccer match sighting, many have said that mass hysteria might have played a role that day. However, witnesses all have stated that something was in the sky. Not only did witnesses in the stadium see it, but people all around Florence reported strange objects in the sky, and many outside the stadium saw the UFO over the stadium that day. We have various types of documentation with multiple newspapers covering it, as well as players on the team being interviewed in the early 2000s confirming it was true. This is clearly not a case of a story being handed down generation to generation and being exaggerated. It's clear that if something like that were to happen today, thousands of photos and videos would be taken. This leads many to believe that the visitors have wised up and know what they can and cannot get away with. In January 1981, a strange, unidentified flying object descended on a farm in France. The property was located near the village of Trans-en-Provence in the Var region in southeastern France. While thousands of UFO sightings have been reported over the decades, what makes this case truly unique is the amount of physical evidence left behind. Even more so, much of the evidence collected was analyzed but left scientists baffled. As a result, this case has been called by some as the most credible close encounter of the second kind in modern history. In this episode, we will explore the Trans-en-Provence UFO sighting. On the afternoon of January 8th, 1981, a farmer named Bernardo Nicolai, then aged 55, was working on his farm when he would hear a strange noise that sounded like whistling. As he turned around, he saw a craft hovering in the air. Oddly, the craft was whistling, and there was no smoke or flames or anything underneath the ship. Nicolai would describe the UFO like many have. It was in the form of two saucers upside down, one against the other. The craft was smaller than most sightings, being only around 5 feet high. The object was silver and had a border running around the circumference of it. Nikolai said there were two circles which looked like doors. In addition, they appeared to be 2 feet protruding from the bottom, extending around 8 inches beneath the ship. The craft was hovering just over a pine tree toward the end of its property. The stunned farmer would see the craft was not leaving, but was descending toward the ground. As this was occurring, Nikolai began walking toward the craft. The UFO would eventually settle down in an area just in front of his small cabin. As Nikolai got closer, the whistling sound intensified. At that time, Nikolai was around 100 feet from where the object had landed. It then began to ascend and reached the height of the pine trees. At that point, it stopped momentarily and then suddenly shot off into the distance. After it disappeared, Nikolai walked toward the landing spot closer and noticed a circle around 7 feet in diameter. While the sighting was surely fascinating, what happened next was really intriguing. Nikolai believed the craft was an experimental military device, as he lived near a military base, so he notified local police that day. The police would come out and interview Nikolai, as well as collect soil samples around the landing site. It's important to point out this occurred within 24 hours of the sighting. The police would then notify GPAN on January 12th, just 4 days after the event occurred. GPAN is an unidentified aerospace phenomenon study group which was established in 1977 within the National Center for Space Studies. During this time, the police and the UFO group were cooperating with one another. The UFO group would send out one of their own UFO investigators to analyze the landing site and speak with Nikolai. The lead investigator on the case was Jean-Jacques Velasco. After Velasco and his team collected soil samples and other vegetation from the landing site, they would be sent to several government laboratories. Some of these included the Sneed Laboratory, Toulouse University, and University of Metz. As they tested the soil and vegetation against a nearby control sample, the scientists were astounded by the results. Perhaps the scientist that examined and discussed his findings the most was Michel Bougnat. Bougnat told a French magazine in 1983 named Francois that the leaves all had the characteristics of a young age, but they presented the biochemical characteristics of leaves at an advanced stage. He went on to say that the biochemical characteristics of those leaves don't resemble anything on planet Earth. Furthermore, in a scientific report published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, Bougnat concluded that something unusual had occurred on that day. Other laboratories would reach the same conclusion as to the perplexing results of the chemical analysis on the soil and the leaves. For example, it was determined the chlorophyll pigment in leaf samples was weakened from 50% to 30%. The younger leaves stood the most serious losses. Scientists were also able to determine that the soil had been heated to an extreme heat somewhere in the range of 300 to 600 degrees Fahrenheit. In addition, the ground had been compressed by a pressure of around 4 to 5 tons. Some criticized this specific finding, since this could have been caused by a vehicle. Researchers also point out that the strange findings were not consistent with nuclear radiation. They would go on to speculate that another type of energy source must have been responsible for the strange, perplexing findings. In particular, it is thought the aged leaves and strange findings in the dirt samples could have been caused by the emission of some type of electromagnetic field. One other interesting, unique characteristic of this case is that traces were still able to be found 40 days after the event. This gave ample time for samples to be collected and sent to various laboratories throughout France. What can we make of this case? Popular Mechanics, a magazine, called the case perhaps the most completely and carefully documented sighting of all time. In this video, we've just discussed the highlights of the scientific findings. There was extensive analysis done by multiple research institutions, and to date none have been able to explain the discrepancies in the data. In addition, there was a witness who identified the craft. Although it was only one witness, the combination of his eyewitness testimony as well as the mysterious findings provide support that this event did indeed occur. There's been many cases around the world where either lights or strange craft have been seen, and then, in the ensuing days, vegetation is affected. Perhaps the most famous of these are crop circles. Although quickly dismissed as a hoax, some crop circles display features that simply cannot be man-made. In sum, this case appears to have much scientific evidence supporting that something abnormal happened on that afternoon in January 1981. As more and more UFO sightings occur, it should be the case that we will see more and more phenomena like this that can't be explained by modern science. In the summer of 1952 in Washington, D.C., there would be a flurry of UFO sightings seen in and around the city, including the airport, Capitol building, and the White House. These events would gain worldwide attention and be the subject of much debate. The primary events would take place on consecutive Saturday nights, sparking much attention from the White House, CIA, and the Air Force. Many look at the events that happened that summer and ask, what would happen if this occurred in present day? Would this give UFO believers the smoking gun proof they needed and finally allow UFO disclosure? In today's episode, we will examine the Washington UFO incident in the summer of 1952, sometimes called the Washington Flap. While UFO sightings took place over a 3-week span, the most famous and publicized sightings occurred on the nights of July 19th and July 26th. On the night of July 19th at 11:40 p.m., air traffic controller Edward Nugent, who worked at Washington National Airport, saw 7 strange objects on his radar. The objects were around 15 miles southwest of the city. Nugent knew immediately that something strange was going on. The movements of the objects were radical, and they didn't appear to be following any flight plan. Nugent contacted his supervisor, Harry Barnes, who had 2 other air traffic controllers check Nugent's radar to make sure it was working properly. Barnes then phoned controllers Howard Coughlin and Joe Zacco, who worked at National Airport's radar-equipped control tower. They said they saw a strange bright light on the radar shooting across the screen. Coughlin went to look out the window and saw a bright object hovering in the sky. It then suddenly flew away at lightning speed. Coughlin remembers thinking, "What the hell was that?" As more objects appeared, and some appeared to head over the White House and Capitol building, Barnes would then call Andrews Air Force Base. The situation had become much more serious. Initially, Andrews Air Force Base didn't see the objects, but soon they did. The radar operators at Andrews Air Force Base saw the strange blips. Objects appeared on the screen and then quickly zipped away at speeds exceeding 7,000 miles per hour. As the blips on the radar screen had floated over the White House, a call was placed to get fighter jets in transit to D.C. During this time, S.C. Pearman, a Capitol pilot, spotted what he thought was a meteor. His tower informed him they had spotted 6 unknown objects close to his position. Pearman would see the objects and describe them as white, tailless, and fast-moving. He saw them over a 14-minute period. He reported that the lights took off at incredible speeds. Around 3 a.m., 2 Air Force F-94 Starfire jet fighters arrived over Washington, D.C. Almost as soon as they arrived, the UFOs vanished off radar and disappeared. The fighter pilots circled around looking for the UFOs, but they could not be found. As the jets' fuel ran low and they had to return to base, the UFOs returned. This led many to speculate that the UFOs were monitoring our radio traffic. That night, the UFOs were last detected by radar around 5:30 a.m. These sightings attracted much attention in the press the following days. Coincidentally, Edward Ruppelt, the head of Project Blue Book, was in Washington, D.C. at the time. Project Blue Book was the U.S. Air Force's investigation into UFOs. Ruppelt heard about the UFO sightings, but interestingly, was somewhat stonewalled in trying to investigate the matter. For example, he wanted to travel around the city and investigate witnesses. However, the government wouldn't provide him a car, and he was told to pay for it out of pocket with a taxi. As a result, Ruppelt didn't thoroughly investigate the July 19th and July 20th UFO sightings due to his frustration. 1 week later, Saturday, July 26, more UFO sightings would occur. Around 8:15 p.m., a pilot and flight attendant working for National Airlines would spot strange lights over their plane. Radar at both the National Airport and Andrews Air Force Base picked up the unknown objects too. During this time, Albert Schopp, a spokesman for Project Blue Book, came to National Airport. He joined with the radar personnel around 9:30, and at this time radar was picking up multiple objects. The UFOs sometimes moved slowly, other times they moved extremely fast, being clocked at over 7,000 miles per hour. At 11:30 p.m., 2 fighter pilot jets arrived over Washington, D.C. once again. The 2 pilots were John Mahugo and William Patterson. Mahugo was given the location of the objects, but when he arrived, he found nothing. Patterson did spot the crafts though. He saw 4 white glows and began chasing them. However, he was no match for the incredible speeds the crafts flew at. More commercial aircrafts would see bright lights as well that night. Both nights produced headlines around the country of the UFO sightings. It's important to remember the summer of 1952 was an extremely popular year for UFOs in the United States. In April of 1952, an article in Life magazine indicated that the government was taking UFOs seriously. Life was the first well-respected news outlet to take UFOs seriously in its writing. The summer of 1952 had become to be known as the UFO flap due to the rash of sightings and widespread media attention. For example, the Air Force had 717 UFO reports during the UFO flap. The 4 years prior, the Air Force had a total of only 615 reports. It's estimated 16,000 news articles were written about UFOs during the UFO flap. With so much attention and objects coming into restricted airspace, it garnered the attention of the White House and CIA. President Harry Truman listened to calls on the matter with his liaison and Project Blue Book leader Edward Ruppelt. Ruppelt indicated that the sightings could have been the result of a temperature inversion. A temperature inversion is when a layer of warm, moist air covers a layer of cool, dry air close to the ground. It's said this can cause radar signals to bend and give false readings. However, it's important to point out that Ruppelt hadn't discussed this theory with any of the radar operators that saw the objects that night. The Air Force would come out with an explanation as well. John Samford, a spokesman for the U.S. Air Force, would state that the UFO sightings over Washington were misidentified aerial phenomena like stars or meteors that people saw. The unknown radar objects were the result of temperature inversion, which was present on both nights. Samford reiterated that solid materials did not appear on the radar, and there was no threat to national security. One witness, the night of July 19th, claims there was no objects in the sky. Air Force Captain Harold May was in the radar center at Andrews Air Force Base. Once he heard about the unknown objects in the sky, he went outside. May said he saw a light that was changing from red to orange to green and to red again. At times it dipped suddenly and appeared to lose altitude. In time, May says he realized that he was seeing a star that was distorted by the atmosphere and that the movement was only an illusion. It's important to note here, though, that May was testifying on behalf of his employer. The Air Force and he might have been persuaded to give this testimony for fear of reprisal. Since these statements, there's been much debate over the findings. Many skeptics point out that radar systems back in 1952 had many flaws. They say that in 1952, radar wasn't sophisticated enough to filter out many ordinary objects, like flocks of birds, weather balloons, or a temperature inversion. However, many argue with this claim and point out that controllers that night were seasoned radar experts and would have been able to identify a solid metallic object versus false targets. In 2002, Howard Coughlin told the Washington Post that he was still convinced that he saw objects that night. Coughlin stated, "I saw it on the radar screen and out the window over Washington National Airport." While the debate goes on over the incident, perhaps the most relevant event to come from the sightings was the Robertson panel. With such a high number of UFO reports in 1952, both the CIA and Air Force became concerned an enemy could flood the country with false UFO reports and surprise attack the United States. In January 1953, the Robertson panel was formed. The panel was composed of leading scientists and led by physicist Howard P. Robertson. The panel spent 4 days looking at the best UFO cases provided by Project Blue Book. Afterwards, they recommended that Project Blue Book shouldn't publicize UFO cases that went unsolved. The goal was to try and take the mystery and popularity out of the UFO phenomena. This decision would have a major impact on UFO disclosure up to present day. So what can we make of these sightings in Washington, D.C. in 1952? It seems more likely than not something was in the sky those nights. Objects were seen by multiple witnesses from a variety of vantage points and also seen by multiple radars on several nights. It's tough to imagine so many people falsely identified a UFO as a planet and that experienced radar operators couldn't filter out spurious objects. We also have to remember in modern day we've seen similar reports from the US military. Numerous reports detail unknown objects zipping thousands of miles an hour and being seen by both pilots and radar. One can only wonder what would happen in present day if this were to occur again. Perhaps, though, the visitors are aware of our technological capabilities and know what they can and can't get away with. On November 17, 1986, a captain and 2 crew members of Japanese airline cargo flight 1628 would allege to see something truly bizarre in the sky. While flying over Alaska, Captain Kenji Torachi, First Officer Takanori Tamafuji, and Flight Engineer Yoshi Tsukuba would spot strange lights in the sky. What the men experienced next would truly astound them, though. In today's episode, we will examine the events surrounding Japanese Flight 1628 on that evening, as well as the ensuing investigation. On November 17, 1986, Flight 1628 was in transit to Alaska. The cargo plane was carrying French wine and had departed from France and was flying to Tokyo with a planned stop in Anchorage to refuel. Around 5:10 p.m. during the flight, the Anchorage Air Traffic Control Center contacted Flight 1628, and the flight controller asked the captain to turn left about 15 degrees. Sitting on the left side of the cockpit, Captain Torachi and the crew saw two strange white lights to the left and below. At first, they ignored them as they believed they were military planes. After a few minutes, though, the men came to realize something surprising. The lights were something else, and instead of moving further away or closer, they appeared at the same distance. In other words, they appeared to be tracking with the plane. At this time, First Officer Tamafuji radioed the Anchorage Control Center and asked if there were any other aircrafts in the vicinity. They responded that no other were there, and the ground radar didn't show any other aircraft as well. The lights then began moving at an incredible speeds and moving in ways no aircraft could. After 7 to 10 minutes, the two lights began moving in and remarkably settled in front of Flight 1628, only around 1,000 feet in front of the airplane. Amazingly, the craft was staying right in front of it and keeping a safe distance. As for the two lights, they appeared square, and each object had parallel, rectangular bars that ran horizontal. The bars had what Captain Torachi described as exhaust flames as they lit up randomly, and Torachi believed the white and amber lights allowed the craft to balance. As the lights flashed, it lit up the inside of the cockpit, and Captain Torachi would later report that he felt the warmth of the lights on his face. After some time, the two small crafts would ascend upward and fly away. Around 15 minutes later, the crew saw a white, horizontal light in the distance. Inside the cockpit, the men would see a large object appear around 7 to 8 miles from them on the satellite. The object was located in the same location that the men had saw the light earlier. As 1628 was flying over Fairbanks, the crew then realized that a large, walnut-shaped object was now tracking them. It had two white lights on the edges of the craft. There were several white lights flashing on top. Perhaps most astonishing, though, was the size of the craft. Captain Torachi reported that the UFO was around the size of 2 aircraft carriers. In addition, the ship moved easily and quietly. Described by Captain Torachi as the mothership, the massive ship was tracking Flight 1628. In order to try and lose the mothership, the flight gained permission from air traffic control to change direction. The plane ultimately did a full circle, but the massive craft kept following with ease. During this time, air traffic control offered to send a fighter pilot jet, but Torachi refused as he believed the jet might inadvertently tempt the UFO to become aggressive. As the men continued into Anchorage, air traffic control asked the United Airlines flight to get a visual confirmation of Flight 1628. This was done since none of the radars in air traffic control saw the huge craft. As the planes flew by one another, they flashed their landing lights. At this time, though, the craft had vanished, and the United crew didn't spot the UFO. Flight 1628 would soon land and begin their debrief. All three men would verify that they saw something on the flight, although their accounts and opinions of what it was were different. Captain Tarachi was the most outspoken and adamant that they had witnessed a UFO. He provided the most details and seemed to be the one who saw the most based on his seat on the plane. It's important to point out Captain Tarachi was an experienced pilot with more than 10,000 hours flight experience. In his debrief, the senior pilot would discuss his thoughts how no man-made machine could do what he witnessed. However, skeptics point out that Tarachi was a UFO aficionado and had made up prior reports of UFOs, which seemed to annoy his employer. In the ensuing months after he made his claim, Tarachi was assigned a desk job for several years as the company believed he had embarrassed them. One controversial aspect of this case is the manner in which the investigation was conducted with Tamafuji and Tsukuba. The debrief of First Officer Tamafuji was done in English, not Japanese, leading many to believe key details were lost in translation. Using an interpreter, the details of what he witnessed exactly and when are difficult to decipher. Tamafuji did note that he had difficulty seeing much of it because of where he was sitting. He went on to say he definitely saw the lights, but wasn't entirely sure that it was a craft. The interview of flight engineer Tsukuba was a more accurate interview, being done in the language of Japanese. He agrees with Tarachi's assessment that there were lights in the sky, but doesn't state that a craft or crafts were visible. Over the years, many have disputed these interviews and believe that the men's words were twisted. Some believe the men were asked leading questions and some of the key information was omitted. Others state the men have kept quiet for fear of repercussion from the airline. One of the biggest questions surrounding this case involves the radar data. Officially, it wasn't captured by any radar. There were a total of 4 radars that were monitoring the skies when Flight 1628 was flying over it. Some appear to have produced false positive or blips during the time. Still, it's very reasonable to assume that avoiding radar technology wouldn't be difficult for an advanced civilization. While officially the results show none of the radars tracked the object, an interview by John Callahan in 2000, then an FAA high-ranking official, shed some light on what the military tracked. According to Callahan, he recalled a frantic phone call from the FAA in Alaska a week after the event. The FAA told him they confirmed a UFO was in the air and was causing quite the media stir. In addition, the FAA detailed that the UFO had chased a 747 across the skies for around 30 minutes. Callahan requested all the data be sent to DC. Callahan was able to analyze the data and realized that the Anchorage Air Traffic Control didn't see the UFOs on the radar, but the NORAD Regional Operations Control Center clearly was tracking the UFO. The center had more sophisticated tracking, such as height-finding radar, long-range radar, and short-range radar. So if they didn't catch it on one of their systems, they would catch it on another one. The reports show that the UFOs were traveling thousands of miles per hour in the area around Flight 1628. Even more surprising, when the United flight began approaching Flight 1628, the UFO circled around behind the United flight and began following it. Callahan alleges he went to multiple meetings about the event and was told to stay quiet about it. When he inquired, why don't they tell the general public, a high-ranking official stated it would cause mass panic. So what can we make of the UFO sightings around Flight 1628? There continues to be much debate on the sighting. It's important to remember, though, this happened at a time when UFO sightings were typically met with ridicule. There appears to only be 3 witnesses who saw it, but it's very possible that the 2 crew members didn't elaborate on the details out of fear of retaliation. Some believe that the pilot saw Jupiter or Mars and thought they were UFOs. This explanation seems illogical, as the pilot was experienced. This case has garnered much controversy, but with more people becoming believers in the UFO phenomenon than 40 years ago, it seems more and more people are starting to believe Captain Torachi. On the night of October 18, 1977, in the northern state of Para, a woman named Clodomira Paxio woke up to a strange green light coming through her window. As the light shined on her face, the air got warmer, and Paxio attempted to cover her face and roll back to sleep. Soon, though, she realized she couldn't, and the light changed to red. Fully awake at this point, she spotted a strange creature standing in her bedroom. She stated it resembled a man, wearing tight-fitted clothing like a scuba diver. The being then lifted a device that looked like a gun and aimed it at the woman. It shot at her, and the beam hit her in the chest. The laser was hot and painful, and the woman was in a paralyzed state due to the overwhelming fear she felt. The woman would later state she believed the being collected her blood. While this event is certainly frightening, it is one of many that occurred in the Brazilian city of Calhouros and the surrounding area during 1977 and 1978. In today's episode, we will discuss these mysterious and unexplainable UFO events, which became to be identified by the Brazilian military as Operation Saucer. Operation Saucer was a top-secret investigation by the Brazilian Air Force into the UFO sightings and attacks that have surrounded the northern section of the state of Para. Unlike other UFO sightings that have occurred around the world, this case is unique in that not only were there mass witnesses, but many of these witnesses were said to be attacked by the UFOs. According to the Brazilian newspaper O Liberal, it was reported that a variety of sizes and shapes flew over the Baía de Marajo region at low altitudes, around 30 to 50 feet in the air, and fired strange light beams at the public. Witnesses reported the object's pilots were small, around 3 to 4 feet. As hysteria set in, the people gave names to the strange visitors: vampire lights, bugs, the thing, and simply chupa chupa, which is Portuguese for sucker sucker. Things got so bad that women and children fled the area while the men stayed behind to watch over their homes. Frighteningly, the beams gave off high radiation that caused puncture marks and lesions. Some victims reported to local media that it felt like a heavy weight pushed against their chest. The beam was described about 7 or 8 centimeters in diameter and white in color. It is said the beams never hunted for them, but hit them suddenly. When the witnesses were hit by the beams, they were then paralyzed. They tried to scream, but no sound came out. Their eyes were open, and they felt the intense heat on their skin like a cigarette burn. Dr. Wide Cecum Carvalho, who worked in the area during the 1970s, noted how many of the witnesses had lesions looking like radiation injuries. These usually began with intense reddening of the skin. Later, hair would fall out and the skin would turn black. She also noted that there was no pattern in the victims, with all ages affected, both men and women. One other claim from Dr. Carvalho is that she was forced to lie to patients by the military. She alleges she had to tell patients they were hallucinating these things. The stories around the attacks were truly horrifying. One man, who was warned not to shoot at the UFOs, decided to shoot anyways, and the results were disastrous. A 60-year-old man took his rifle and shot at one of the flying saucers. Then, a light surrounded him, and he was paralyzed. He fell to the ground. The first few days this occurred, the man could barely move and had problems hearing, seeing, and speaking. Eventually, after a few weeks, he regained his strength and was back to normal. The saucers were not only in the air, but also under the water. It was reported fishermen saw bluish lights flying through the water. They also reported seeing saucers fly in and out of the water effortlessly. Members of the military would report activity in the water as well. Many would speculate that the UFO base was under the water. As the attacks were happening, the Brazilian Air Force was called in to investigate. Perhaps the most famous and most compelling piece of evidence in this case is the interview given by the leader of this investigation, Captain Urange Holanda, who gave the interview to Adelmar J. Javard, the editor of the Brazilian monthly magazine, Revista UFO. In the magazine, Holanda described how terrified his men were during this case. Just 3 months after giving the interview, Captain Holanda was found hanged with his own bathrobe belt on the second floor of his house by his daughter. It is said in the book, Extraterrestrial Vampires of the Amazon, by ufologist Daniel Rabiso Geese, that some military members suffered nervous breakdowns, while some went completely insane during the course of the investigation. Despite all these mysterious events and mass witnesses, the Brazilian government decided to declassify the military report known as Operation Saucer in 2004. To put to scale how much activity occurred, the report holds 2,000 pages, 500 photographs, and 16 hours of film. At the time it was compiled, it was classified as top secret and sent to military leaders. Perhaps what's most interesting about this case is that all the evidence in the report supports the hypothesis of something extraterrestrial in nature, yet the conclusion of the report does not indicate it was UFOs. Over the years, there's been two main theories surrounding these events. The first is that this was some type of military experiment. People who believe this tend to point to things like the military cover-up and the strange death of Captain Hollanda. It was said Hollanda's conscience had gotten to him over the years. Was Hollanda punished for speaking out against the top secret military he was aware of? Or was another country testing out something? None of this really explains the underwater sightings, although this could be due to people possibly being swept up in the mania. Another possibility is that the strange lights could have just been animals in the ocean. While the military hypothesis is certainly possible, the more popular theory is that this was something extraterrestrial in nature. Still, one thing to question about this event is just why the people were being zapped. Were they being abducted? Were they being marked somehow? One other question to ask is that we've never seen something like this on such a massive scale, and especially over such a long period. Despite all the questions, it's clear something strange and unexplainable was happening. We may never know the exact reasons why this occurred. It's important to point out, though, that trying to understand another animal's motivation is often met with endless questions. We can only assume that any extraterrestrial life most likely thinks much, much differently. On the night of December 29th, 1980, 3 individuals would witness a massive UFO, and this event would change their lives forever. Unlike other UFO sightings and even some abductions, the witnesses would suffer appalling injuries that would hinder their lives for years and eventually lead to the death of 2 of them. This event is widely regarded as one of the most well documented and well studied close encounters of the second kind. Besides the three witnesses, many others would witness the craft, as well as the large number of military helicopters flying around that night. This incident became to be known as the Cash Landrum case, named after the three witnesses. The first witness was Betty Cash. Betty then was a 51-year-old businesswoman who owned a restaurant and a grocery store. The second witness was Vicki Landrum. Vicki was 57 at the time and worked for Betty in the restaurant. Colby Landrum, Vicki's grandson, was the third witness, and at the time, he was then 7. Just outside Houston, Texas, in the town of Huffman, around 9 p.m. on December 29, 1980, Betty, Vicki, and Colby had been driving around the Piney Woods area of East Texas looking for a bingo game. After finding out all the games had been canceled, they decided to eat at a diner in New Caney. After finishing their meal around 8:20 p.m., Betty drove them home on Highway FM 1485, a remote road used only by people who live in the area because it is so isolated. Around 50 kilometers from Houston, the area is surprisingly sparsely populated and is covered by oak and pine trees, with swamps and lakes. Around 30 minutes later, Colby would spot a bright light above the treetops, a good distance away. He pointed it out to the women, and as they continued driving, it appeared to be getting larger and larger. Soon, though, the three would realize the object was getting closer and closer to the road, and they began to get worried. The woman thought, based on the speed it was going, they could drive by it and avoid it altogether. Soon, though, they realized the object had cut in front of them and was hovering right above the road. As they saw the burning diamond-shaped craft, Vicki screamed that they would be burned alive if they kept driving. The object was hovering and also shooting down flames of fire occasionally. As the car eventually came to a full stop, the UFO was around 60 meters away. The witnesses would later describe it as being aluminum-like and glowing so bright that it lit up the surrounding forest like daylight. The 4 points of the diamond were dull rather than sharp, and blue spots circled around the object. It also let out some type of beeping sound as well. The fire was so dense and powerful under the UFO that if it hadn't been over the road, a forest fire surely would have ensued. As they watched the diamond-shaped UFO, the car's interior and exterior became heated and hot, which prompted the three to exit the vehicle. Feeling a burning sensation on their faces, the three watched the craft in disbelief. Colby would get back in the car first and beg his grandmother to get back in, but Vicki, a devout Christian, eventually got back in but was convinced, seeing the object, it was the end of the world and that Jesus would soon appear. Becky was staring at the object in a trance-like state. Betty was so fascinated by the UFO that she walked in front of the car and stood there gazing at it. The bright light penetrated her skin, burning it, yet she stood there completely in bliss. Eventually, as the object began to hover up and away, she moved back to the car door. When she finally grabbed the car door handle, it was so painfully hot that she had to open it using her leather jacket to protect her hands. As the witnesses all were in the car and the object had left, they then realized just how hot the car was and turned the air conditioner on in the dead of winter. As the UFO began leaving, military helicopters would begin circling the area and came flying in from all directions. Some of the helicopters were identified as large double-rotor CH-47 Chinooks, which are extremely loud and undeniably used in the military. Colby would later state he counted 23 helicopters that came to the spot. These and others would then begin spreading out as the UFO was not found nearby. After the helicopters had dispersed from the scene, Betty, Vicky, and Colby drove back to Dayton, where Betty dropped Vicky and Colby off at home. Betty would return home around 9:50 p.m. There, a friend and her children were waiting for her, but Betty was already starting to feel extremely sick from the event. She was so sick, in fact, that she couldn't even tell them what happened. Betty, Vicky, and Colby were not the only ones to witness the strange events that night, though. A Dayton, Texas policeman who was off duty and his wife were driving home from Cleveland through the Huffman area, and the same night, they too also observed a large number of CH-47 helicopters. Another witness was a man living in Crosby, Texas. He was directly under the flight path of the UFO, and he reported seeing a large number of heavy military helicopters flying overhead. Jerry McDonald, who worked in the oil fields, was in the garden in the backyard in Dayton, and he reported seeing a huge UFO flying directly over his head. At first, he thought it was the Goodyear blimp, but quickly he realized it was something else. It passed about 45 meters above him, and he saw that it had two bright lights on it and a red light in the center. He was quoted as saying it was kind of diamond-shaped and had two twin torches that were shooting brilliant blue flames out the back. As we see, just like Betty Cash and the Landrums, he reported seeing a diamond object with flames. While the incident itself might have been quite fascinating for the women, the aftermath was extremely painful and life-altering. While many UFO sightings and abductions lead to incredible psychological pain, seldom do many of the victims suffer intense, apparent physical pain. In the Cash Landrum case, almost immediately the women began experiencing excruciating pain, which proves that something strange did happen on the night of December 29th, 1980. After returning home, after dropping off the Landrums, over the next few hours, Betty's skin turned red as if she had a bad sunburn. Her neck swelled, and large blisters erupted and broke out on her face. She even had blisters on her scalp and eyelids. She started to vomit and continued to do so non-stop during the night. By morning, she was even worse and almost in a coma. The Landrums would begin to experience their symptoms a bit later. Between midnight and 2 a.m., Vicky and Colby began to suffer similar symptoms, although less severe. At first they began to get something sunburn-like, but then diarrhea and vomiting ensued. The next morning, Betty was moved to Vicky's house, and all three were cared for there. Betty's condition continued to worsen, and 3 days later, she went to the hospital. The burns and swelling altered Betty's appearance so radically that a friend who came to visit her in the hospital didn't recognize her. Her hair was starting to fall out, and her eyes became so swollen she couldn't see for a week. Doctors were perplexed and confused by these symptoms and guessed that they were caused by some type of radiation. The doctors just weren't sure of what could have caused this, though, and as a safety precaution, Betty was moved into a hazmat room in the basement level of the hospital. Visits to her were limited in the beginning because doctors couldn't assess whether she was a danger to others or not. Perhaps one of the most fascinating pieces of evidence surrounding the radiation or perhaps the case in general, comes from Brad Sparks, a nuclear radiologist who examined the case for MUFON. Sparks determined the type of radiation was not ionizing radiation, which is the only type of radiation that causes radiation sickness. Microwave and UV radiation, as well as visible light radiation, do not and cannot cause radiation sickness. It's important to note all the victims showed signs of radiation sickness. One other thing that Sparks found concerning the onset of the radiation: the three experienced the radiation sickness so quickly that if it had been ionizing radiation, they would have died in weeks. If the Cash-Landrum trio had true radiation sickness from ionizing radiation, they would have been dead within days or weeks, because the onset of the symptoms was so rapid, within about half an hour, and so severe that it's the symptoms of supposed ionizing radiation syndrome. It indicates a 100% fatal dose. This finding raises the question, what type of radiation exactly did the witnesses encounter? One fascinating thing about this case, as well, is this incident occurred the night before the Rendlesham Forest incident in England. That incident is considered one of the most famous in the world, and shockingly, there are similar characteristics between the two. Both had intense heat, and verifiable radiological after effects were associated with both events. Both events had craft that shared design elements, including diamond and pyramid shapes. Still, this isn't the first time a person has suffered similar radiological effects from a close encounter of the second kind. On May 20th, 1967, around lunchtime, Stephen Michalak, an industrial mechanic from Winnipeg, was prospecting in the Falcon Lake area of Manitoba, Canada, when he alleged to come into physical contact with a landed UFO. Michalak would later experience radiation sickness and burns. The area was examined as well and found to be radioactive. We will examine this case, regarded as one of Canada's most famous, in more detail in future episodes. After the event, John Schuessler of MUFON was one of many who would examine the event. He organized a team of specialists that were able to find additional eyewitnesses, as well as scorch marks on nearby trees. Perhaps evidence of a military cover-up was the discovery that the stretch of highway where the sighting happened was quickly repaved just days after the event. There was no paper trail with Montgomery County or the state of Texas. An unnamed witness later came forward and stated driving to work in the early dark hours, he saw a road crew paving the road where the UFO was seen. He was routed another direction and thought it was odd at the time because both sides of the road were closed. At the time, he wasn't aware of the UFO sightings, and only later did he make the connection. A History Channel episode of UFO hunters would examine this and uncover the remote road was indeed completely replaced with new pavement. After all the suffering the women went through, they were convinced that this was an experimental craft from the US military and that it had caused their suffering and illness. As such, they filed a lawsuit against the US government in 1982. However, legal attempts to get answers from the government failed time and time again because it could not be proven that the UFO or the helicopters were US government property. Finally, in 1986, a judge dismissed the entire case, citing expert testimony that no such craft existed in the military. Over the years, there's been various theories as to what the Landrums and Betty Cash saw that night. The most popular, probably, is that this was an experimental military craft. This seems to be the most popular theory because the number of military helicopters seen in close proximity to the craft. Many feel the helicopters wouldn't have been able to get to the craft so quickly unless it was a military exercise. Others dispute this though and point out if a UFO had came down and had been ground level for some time, the military could have mobilized and reached it. The radiation from the craft also leads some people to believe that this was an experimental nuclear engine powered military craft. However, it's unlikely the military would fly something emitting radiation in the public. For something like this, they would almost certainly fly it in one of their restricted areas where only military is allowed. The second theory holds that this was indeed a UFO. This seems to be the theory that makes the most sense. The craft was described as 90 feet tall, and today, even 43 years later, we don't have anything that large capable of flying. Also, the fact that the Rendlesham Forest incident occurred and the radiation was non-ionizing, yet caused immediate sickness, leads many to conclude it was from an unknown origin. John Schuessler, lead MUFON investigator on the Cash Landrum case, concluded that the craft wasn't one of ours. The last theory holds that this event didn't occur. This seems extremely unlikely given the pain and suffering the witnesses occurred, both physically and mentally. The events would affect the rest of their lives. Also, the incident was seen by multiple witnesses. This case has been studied intensely for decades, and to date, we're no closer to solving this mystery than we were 40 years ago. On February 18, 1977, Angel Maria Tana, a cattle rancher, woke up and began doing his chores around his 3,000-acre property. Tana, his family, and numerous workers kept busy with large acreage and tending to hundreds of cattle and sheep. Their lives, up until February of that year, were pretty typical for a rural family. However, strange things had been happening to the family fairly recently. They had been seeing UFOs around the property. Despite this, it was business as usual, and on February 18th, Mr. Tana, his foreman, and the family dog, named Dunce, began to work. Beginning their day, Mr. Tana turned on the generator to light up the property, and soon, around 4:10 a.m., Tana and his foreman were driving around 80 cows toward the barn for milking. Then, suddenly, the generator lights went out. On the far side of the barn, Tana saw around 100 yards away a bright light. At first, Tana thought it was a fire and began running toward it, accompanied by Dunce. Then suddenly, he heard a loud bang and saw a burning object that was hovering just behind the barn, off the ground. The craft had two disc-like plates and was a bright orangish color. Tana watched in amazement until his foreman caught up with him and notified him the cows were going crazy and running away. In addition, all the dogs on the property were barking. Right then, the object began moving south, away and over some trees. Tana, his foreman, and Dunce would run away from it, heading west on the property. However, they kept it in sight, and the light from the craft was extremely bright, lighting up the whole property. The object moved about 100 feet south of the barn, and the light seemed to have some sort of mystical effect on Tana as he began moving toward it instead of running away from it. As Tana was seemingly pulled toward it, Dunce came along and the craft reversed direction, heading toward them. It got within about 60 feet of Tana, and at this point, Dunce ran forward to protect Tana and stopped short about 15 feet from the hovering craft. It sat on the ground and looked up at the object, howling. As the object got toward Tana, he said he felt intense heat and electric shocks throughout his body. He tried to cover his eyes from the light as it was so bright, but he was drawn to it. Tana would watch the craft for several minutes, after which it would turn away from orange to red and begin moving away. It moved over the forest and soon was out of sight. While Tana, his foreman, and Dunsey witnessed the event from the yard, his son, who was then 19 years old, saw the craft and the whole incident from inside the house. The family would feel the effects after the sighting. Mr. Tana's arm, the same one which he held to block the light, was extremely red. A doctor examined it and said it was most likely due to radiation. In time, though, the wound would heal. While Mr. Tana recovered, the family dog Dunsey did not. After the incident, Dunsey refused to eat. 3 days later, Dunsey went to the same mound where he had looked up at the craft and died. An autopsy performed revealed all of the blood vessels had ruptured. It concluded that something not natural and very hot had caused the dog to die from internal bleeding. As briefly mentioned earlier, this family experienced sightings for several months in early 1977. On the day of February 18th, other farmers in the area would report seeing bright lights from their farm as well. While Dunsey unfortunately died, it seems the family was able to move on and peacefully live their lives. On August 14th, 1947, Professor R.L. Johannes was out painting near the Chiarso Creek at Via Santina, which is in the extreme northeastern province of Italy. It was early in the morning, around 9 a.m., when suddenly Johannes would spot a 30-foot disc-shaped object descending and eventually landing nearby. The craft was bright red and appeared to be stuck on the rocks on the hillside. Two beings seemingly manifested right next to the ship once the ship had settled. The witness stated that they were about 3 feet tall, wearing dark blue overalls with a bright red collar and a belt. Also, they wore circular helmets on their heads that seemed a lot larger than they should be. Strangely, their faces were not covered, and he could see their faces had a greenish tint, and their eyes were large and dark purplish with a vertical line. They had no eyelashes, nor eyebrows. Both had a straight and large nose. The being's hands were claw-like, greenish in color, and they had 4 fingers on each. What happened next would truly shock the artist. He enthusiastically waved at the beings in a friendly manner. However, the entities didn't interpret the greeting as the artist had hoped. One of the beings touched the center of its belt, and a thin vapor shot at the man, causing him to fall onto his back. He was conscious, but somewhat paralyzed, and he laid on his back helplessly as the small creatures approached. They came within about 2 yards and picked up his easel, which had been knocked to the ground. The artist was able to see that the beings were likely smaller than his easel. Both entities were panting heavily, as if out of breath. After a few minutes, the beings returned to the ship. The craft then rose from the ground, hovered, and then instantaneously shrunk before vanishing into thin air. There's some disagreement among ufologists about what had happened here. Some say the craft flew away at incredible speeds, and this caused an optical illusion. Others say the craft actually did shrink. It's unclear exactly how the craft did disappear, but we should note the professor felt an incredible blast of wind when it left. The wind was so strong he rolled over several times. After some time, the witness regained his strength and got up. Immediately he noticed that his easel had disappeared. One of the first things that people note when hearing this story today is the year and time this event occurred. It happened in August 1947, just several months after pilot Kenneth Arnold witnessed 9 unidentified flying objects that he described looked like saucers. Also around this time was the Roswell incident in July 1947. Both events raise many questions about this event. One, is this sighting related to the other sightings at this time? It's surely possible, although with the craft being bright red, that doesn't match descriptions of the craft from Roswell or the Arnold case. Another question concerns the hostility the being showed. Many have speculated that the beings interpreted the wave as a threat. The witness was waving with his paintbrush in his hand. Did they believe that the brush was some type of weapon? It should be noted that there are other cases where a powder or vapor substance has been used on a human. One question concerns whether the professor got caught up in the flying saucer craze. It's certainly possible, but this angle was explored, and most agreed the flying saucer craze hadn't hit Italy at this time. Most of the papers weren't giving it much press. One thing that sticks out in the case is the witness saw little green men. This was what most aliens were thought to look like back in the 40s and 50s. A classic case where little green men were seen was the Kelly Hopkinsville incident that occurred in Kentucky in 1955. Did the witness see the same entities that were seen in Kentucky in 1955? We will probably never get the answer to many of these questions. Still, this is one fascinating case. Perhaps the most popular type of UFO sightings are when witnesses report seeing orbs. Orbs are generally defined as a spherical body radiating some sort of light, although there's certainly many variations in terms of what people see. It's said that this is the most misidentified type of UFO sighting, since these objects are often seen from a distance, and all too often at night. We must also acknowledge that many of these sightings have natural explanations. Still, though, many orbs are not able to be identified, and intriguingly, many cases involve multiple orbs. Furthermore, often these orbs travel at incredible speeds and shift in the blink of the eye. In today's episode, we will examine a fascinating case from Texas that occurred in the early 1950s. On the evening of August 25th, 1951, 4 scientists were sitting around drinking tea at the home of geology professor Dr. W.I. Robinson. All the men were professors at Texas Tech and were considered incredibly bright and reputable. The other 3 men were chemical engineering professor Dr. A.G. Oberg, physics professor Dr. George, and Dr. W.L. Ducker, the head of the petroleum engineering department. Around 9:20 p.m., suddenly a V-shaped formation of 15 to 30 bluish-green lights began passing through the sky. The professors were stunned and looked on in disbelief. The lights would pass over quickly, not allowing the professors to get a long look, but all were in agreement. Something bizarre had truly just occurred. Naturally, they initially began to look for the scientific explanation as to what they saw. The next hour, the professors would discuss what exactly they had seen. The lights were bright, extremely bright, but the professors knew they weren't stars, nor meteors. During this time, they deduced that the lights would come back, and sure enough, an hour later, they reappeared in the sky, although they weren't in any formation as they had been prior. Other credible witnesses would see the objects that night as well. Some 350 miles away, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, an employee of the Atomic Energy Commission's top secret Sandia Corporation was sitting outside with his wife on what they described as a beautiful night. Then, both of them suddenly saw what appeared to be an airplane with bluish lights on the wings. After that night, the professors who saw the lights were adamant to discover what it was exactly. They contacted the Air Force Base to report the incident, but didn't get any sort of answer that explained what it was. So the Texas Tech professors started their own informal investigation. They formed two teams to stake out different areas and communicated with walkie-talkies. In the weeks after their initial August 25th sighting, they and their friends observed the lights 12 more times. They would try and measure the light's angles, its altitude, and speed, but didn't have much luck. Interestingly, they discovered they always traveled from north to south. At this same time, the professors alerted local press, like the Lubbock Avalanche Journal. In the coming days, more Lubbock residents claimed to have seen the orbs in the skies. The residents' accounts matched what the professors had seen. These blue-green lights were witnessed multiple times by hundreds of people. With so many sightings occurring, this drew the attention of Edward Ruppelt. In the 1950s, Ruppelt oversaw Project Blue Book for the U.S. Air Force, a program that monitored and investigated UFO reports. Ruppelt would later say about the professors, if a group had been handpicked to observe a UFO, we couldn't have picked a more technically qualified group of people. As Ruppelt began his formal investigation, he found that not everyone who saw the lights was curious, but many were terrified. Ruppelt points out an interview with a hardened old man from La Mesa. Despite having a tough background, including fighting in several turf wars, both he and his wife were scared when they saw the objects. Many of the other witnesses Ruppelt interviewed would provide hazy details and vague information. The professors recorded the most detailed information. That was with the exception of perhaps the most convincing piece. A photograph of the lights would be taken by a college freshman at Texas Tech. On August 31st, Texas Tech freshman named Carl Hart Jr. was diligently looking through his window in order to snap a photograph of the lights. He had been in bed about a half hour when he saw the lights appear in the north, cross the clear sky, and disappear over his house. He knew that the lights would probably reappear, as he had seen this happen before, so he grabbed his camera and went out in the backyard. After some time, the lights went over the house, and luckily, Hart was able to snap 2 photos. A bit later, they made a third pass, and he got 3 more pictures. With so many accounts, it's evident that people were indeed seeing something. But the question was, what was it exactly? As Ruppelt wrapped up his investigation, his conclusion was that the professors had seen a type of bird called a plover. He noted the city of Lubbock had installed new vapor street lights in 1951, and Ruppelt believed migrating plovers were reflecting these lights. Some of the witnesses supported this theory too. T.E. Snyder, a local farmer, who on August 31st, 1951, had observed birds flying over a drive-in movie theater, noted the birds' undersides were reflected in the light. Still, not everyone agreed with this theory, though. J.C. Cross, the head of Texas Tech's biology department, who was interviewed by Ruppelt, said that the sightings could not have been birds. Grayson Mead, another professor, insisted that they could not have been birds as well. He stated, "These objects were far too large for any bird. I have had enough experience hunting, and I don't know of any bird that could go this fast. We would not be able to hear to have gone as fast as this. To be birds, they would have to have been exceedingly low to disappear quite so quickly." One other skeptic was William Hams, chief photographer for the Lubbock Avalanche Journal. Hams snapped several nighttime photos of birds flying over Lubbock streetlights, but could not duplicate Hart's photos. However, the most convincing opinion that these objects were not birds comes from Ruppelt himself. Ruppelt would admit later that the objects were not plovers. He later wrote that a professor conducted an experiment showing him that the lights could not be birds. Ruppelt went on to say that the anonymous man showed him it was a natural phenomenon. Still, Ruppelt couldn't say how he knew or what it was because he stated it would give away the man's identity. As the years passed, the professors and the town would move on from the bizarre incidents of that summer. The professors refused to give more interviews, and the mystery of the lights went on. Many questions surfaced from this event, including, did Ruppelt know the plover explanation was weak, and did he try to pivot on what it was? If this was a natural phenomenon, why is it not being seen every summer in the town? It seems that a scientific explanation would have surfaced by now, but nothing plausible has stuck. The Lubbock Lights is truly an incredible case, with multiple independent and credible witnesses seeing the objects over a series of days. Maybe one day these lights will reappear, but until then, this event remains a mystery. On Friday, September 29th, 1995, around 11:30 at night, a young 24-year-old man was driving south in Denmark from the city of Brand towards Vejle. He was on his way to visit his parents and was accompanied by his black Labrador. The night was cool and clear. It seemed like it would be a nice, relaxing drive on a desolate road. However, in moments, things would go from calm to chaos. Suddenly, the speedometer and revolutions counter began acting erratically and shot straight up to the highest. The windshield wipers seemingly turned on by themselves and began moving back and forth quickly. The witness tried turning the wipers on and off, but it didn't work. In the back seat, the dog began acting strangely. Finally, the engine went dead and the car came to a complete stop. The young man was on a deserted, rural road in the pitch black. Initially, the witness was horrified. Any traffic that might come through might not see him, and they may hit him since he was in the middle of the road. He attempted turning the car on several times, but each time, the car had lost all power. A few more seconds would pass, and the man became aware of something above him. He could feel it, although it was strange, and he couldn't see it. Then, an extremely bright light burst from over the car. It was blinking or pulsing at regular intervals, blinding the man. It was primarily white with a little indigo. As the witness looked up through the windshield, he saw a large disc was hovering on top of him. The witness was scared, but decided to open the door and lean halfway out to get a better look. Meanwhile, his dog was in the back terrified. It had gone to the floor and was trying desperately to go under the front seat. The light from the craft was like nothing he had ever seen. As he squinted into the bright light, he saw a large disc, 30 to 50 feet in diameter, about 20 feet above the car. The outer edge of the craft was dark against the background of the starry sky. Just inside, he saw circles aligned side by side from which the light was coming. The closer to the center of the craft, the closer together the circles were. The witness would state the lights were very sharp and came straight down rather than spreading out as light normally does. After a few minutes, the witness saw that the brightness of the light was slowly diminishing. The craft began to slowly hover away, and the witness got back in his car. The witness saw the craft was not flat. It had some type of triangles coming from the top. They were about 10 feet tall each. The UFO kept going with the lights faint underneath. It would eventually crest a hilltop and fade into the night. The witness recalls the craft hovering silently the entire time. After the craft had left, the witness sat in his car shell-shocked for a few minutes. He eventually turned the car back on, and everything was working correctly. His dog, still worked up, was finally starting to calm down some. As the car was back on, one of the first things he would notice is that the clock was at the same time as before the car died. It was 11:31. The man began driving home, still scared and shocked at what had just happened. After driving around 50 miles, he finally reached his parents' home. He would tell them what happened, and later they would convey to UFO investigators just how scared he was when he got home. This story has many of the classic components of a UFO sighting: bright lights, unexplained mechanical and electrical failures, a silent craft. This case is one of many UFO sightings around the world that still to this day remain unsolved. On October 21st, 1954, around 4:45 p.m. in Staffordshire, England, Jessie Rostenberg, age 27, was in her small cottage with her 2-year-old daughter, Karen. Her 2 sons, Anthony, age 8, and Ronald, age 6, were playing outside in the garden. Then, suddenly, Miss Rostenberg heard a strange sound. It sounded like an airplane had crashed. She would later describe it as a sound like water being poured on a fire. As she ran outside, her 2 sons were screaming at her to look up as there was a UFO in the sky. As she looked up, she saw a shiny silver object silently hovering. She said it looked somewhat like a sombrero. The object had a dome on top, which sat 2 occupants. The 2 beings inside, Miss Rostenberg could clearly see as the craft was close and tilted in a position that allowed the beings to be seen and for her to see them. She described them as beautiful and that the occupants wore pale blue jumper suits, had blonde, golden hair, and their heads were in transparent helmets. She noted that while their faces were human-looking, they did seem to have very large foreheads. These aliens are typically called Nordic aliens. She also believed the occupants looked sympathetic as she stood in total shock and awe looking at them. For a second, she glanced at her 2 boys, and when she looked back to the craft, it was gone. She asked her sons where the object had gone, and they pointed up to a small dot in the sky. The craft then circled 3 times in the air and then shot away into the sky. Still terrified, she and her sons ran into the house and hid under the kitchen table until her husband, Tony, came home. The boys refused to go outside for some time, and that night, the frightened dog had ran off. As word spread, the family would be ridiculed for their claims. 3 weeks after the event, UFO researcher Gavin Gibbons would begin investigating the case. In his book, The Coming of the Spaceships, he noted that when he visited the family, they looked visibly shaken. Gibbons believed this family was telling the truth and honest in their story. Fascinatingly, Tony Rostenberg, Jesse's husband, who didn't see the craft, said he saw something unusual on the following night, October 24th, 1954. He climbed the roof of his house and saw a high-speed, cigar-shaped UFO vanish into the clouds. Tony said he saw another craft on December 15th that same year. This time, he saw a bright ball flying silently. After some time, a plane began flying in, and the craft would take off. Jesse Rostenberg's stories has both believers and skeptics, and this is for good reason. During the 1950s, alleged abductions by Nordics was quite prevalent, especially in Europe. Abductions and encounters today is much less, and more people typically report encounters and abductions with gray aliens. Many believe the rise in Nordic sightings in the 1950s was due to George Adamski. Adamski was a Polish-American author who claimed to have been abducted by the Nordics, and that they flew around space together to the moon and other planets. Adamski got quite famous from his stories, as well as the press he received. Skeptics refute his stories and claim he was a con artist. Regardless of what happened, though, the existence of Nordic aliens is supported by other cases. Travis Walton, who stated he was abducted in the mid-1970s, alleged to encounter Nordics. His case is said to be extremely credible for a variety of reasons, such as him passing multiple lie detector tests. There's certainly an argument to be made that the Rostenbergs were motivated by money and fame, something similar to George Adamski. However, we should point out it would probably be difficult to get children to lie and investigators not to be able to tell. Nordic aliens are usually described as having a human-like appearance and closely resembling people from Scandinavian countries. It is said the species are about 6 to 7 feet tall, pale, with blonde hair and blue eyes. They are also said to be very skinny, with long legs, large foreheads, and often being physically attractive. Nordic aliens are sometimes described as being magical, with telepathic powers. Many people who have encountered them say they are paternal, watchful, smiling, affectionate, and youthful. Unlike gray aliens, the Nordic species is described as being friendly toward humans and simply curious about our civilization. These characteristics seem to fit Jessie's story and her experience. One final point in this story is that Jessie has remained adamant in her story throughout the years, never wavering. World War I, like many other wars, was renowned for its harsh conditions. Extremely brutal, soldiers on the front would spend years fighting trench warfare to possibly only gain a few hundred yards of ground. The conditions were especially dangerous as these trenches were filled with rats, corpses, and disease. Despite all this, military propaganda needed heroes and individuals that would keep spirits up during the war. In Germany, one such figure was Baron Manfred von Richthofen, or perhaps better known today as the Red Baron. The Red Baron was one of the most skilled and dangerous fighter pilots of World War I and possibly all time. Loved by his country and respected by his enemies, the Red Baron would shoot down at least 80 planes during his military career. in April 1918, he would be fatally wounded in a mission around 6 months before the end of the war. His death is somewhat controversial, as some say Canadian pilot Arthur Roy Brown shot the plane down, while others say it was anti-machine gun fire. Despite this, many legends surround the Red Baron and his war heroics. One legend, though, concerns something unique. According to German Air Force ace Peter Waitschrick, he watched the Red Baron shoot down a UFO with orange lights over Belgium in 1917. Waitschrick claims that on an early morning mission in western Belgium, a strange craft appeared in the clear blue sky. He and the Red Baron were terrified because they had never seen anything like it. The ace pilot then opened fire and directly hit the UFO. Waitschrick claims that after being hit, the UFO crashed in the nearby woods and two bald-headed aliens jumped out of the craft and disappeared into the woods. After Waitschrick and the Red Baron returned to base, they reported the incident but were told to keep quiet and never mention it again. It's been stated by alien hunter Scott Waring that the Red Baron most likely hit the antenna and that fatally damaged the craft. Throughout history, war has produced more sophisticated and deadly technology. The American Civil War saw the beginning of landmines. World War I introduced machine guns and airplanes, among other things. World War II saw the beginning of radar and nuclear weapons. In the spring of 1917, when the craft was allegedly shot down, the United States had recently entered the war. Both the Baron and Waitschrick were aware that the enemy might have a new type of craft. As such, to this day, no one uses circular aircraft with no visible propulsion systems. After the story came out from Waitschrick, skeptics immediately pointed out the story must be fraudulent. Waitschrick waited until 1997 to tell the story publicly, and before then only told his daughter and his wife. Also, some skeptics point out that with advanced alien technology, there's simply no way a plane from back then could surprise a craft and that a machine gun could damage it. Still, many say that this story has some legitimate aspects to it. For one, why did this 105-year-old man decide to come out and tell his story? There doesn't appear to be any sort of thing he gained by telling it. It seems more likely that this was the case of someone wanting to get something off their chest before they passed away. Also, it seems plausible as well that he kept the secret for years, as he would have been the only one to confirm the story, since the Red Baron was dead. Also, there was quite a negative stigma on people claiming to see flying saucers back then. We can imagine that Waitschrick wanted to protect his family and might not have wanted to put them at risk. Finally, as for the argument that machine guns couldn't hurt a UFO, it's probable that this craft was caught off guard. We also know that UFOs do crash, as we've seen this with quite a few cases. While we will probably never know if this crash occurred, perhaps somewhere in Germany there is a file cabinet with a record of this report. Perhaps one day, Germany and other countries alike will release cases like this. In the initial years of the flying saucer phenomenon, we saw multiple times the government give illogical explanations as to what people were witnessing. And to a certain extent, this makes sense. The American public at the time trusted the government. So when an individual or a group of people witnessed a UFO, the government and military didn't have to be convincing nor creative as to what was being seen. We saw this most notably with the Roswell crash of 1947 and also the Battle of Los Angeles a few years earlier. Many people witnessed these strange objects, and the government responded in both cases by saying it was simply a weather balloon. In today's episode, we will cover another UFO sighting by several people in the early 1960s, and once again, we will see the military provide a completely illogical explanation. On the evening of August 13th, 1960, California Highway Patrol officers Charles A. Carson and Stanley Scott were driving on Hogue Road east of Corning, California. It was a calm and tranquil night, but that would soon change though. As the officers were driving, they soon noticed something massive up in the sky. It looked like a massive airplane heading downward and about to crash. As they believed the plane was going to crash, the men hopped out of the car and watched from the side of the road. Soon, though, they would quickly discover that this was no airplane. The object kept descending down to about 100 feet in complete silence and then quickly changed course and climbed up to around 500 feet. As Carson would later state in his report, it was surrounded by a glow, making the round or oblong object visible. At each end, or each side of the object, there were definite red lights. At times, about 5 white lights were visible between the red lights. As we watched the object move again and perform aerial feats that were actually unbelievable. They continued to watch the UFO, and twice it approached the car, shining a huge red light down below. Officer Carson noted that it appeared they were sweeping the area below with the red light. As it approached, the radio signal would go out with nothing but static. During this time, they radioed the Tohono County Sheriff's Office. They asked Officer Clarence Fry to contact the local Air Force radar station at Red Bluff to see if anything was visible on radar. Deputy Fry radioed back that the radar station verified that something they couldn't identify was indeed visible. The object then slowly began to move to the east, and the officers followed from a safe distance. When the UFO reached the Vina Plains Fire Station, a second unidentified object hovered in from the south. It moved closer to the first object, and both hovered seemingly communicating with the red beams. After some time passed, the objects would vanish to the east. In total, the officers had watched the objects for around 15 minutes. Later, they returned to the sheriff's office and they discovered others there had seen the objects as well. Officers Fry and Montgomery witnessed it, as well as the night jailer. Their reports of the object matched Carson and Scott's. The following day, Carson and Scott drove to the Red Bluff Air Force Base to speak with the operator that had seen it on radar. However, the Air Force denied that the object had been seen on radar. And of course, this contradicted what Deputy Fry had been told. An official explanation was then put out regarding the matter. The Air Force said, the findings are that the individuals concerned witnessed a refraction of the planet Mars and the bright stars Aldebaran and Betelgeuse. Temperature inversions contributed to the phenomenon, as the planet Mars was quite low in the skies, and the inversion caused it to be projected upward. In other words, the Air Force said that the officers were seeing some type of mirage. Mirages are generally described as optical illusions where light passes through air of different temperatures. An inferior mirage occurs when you have a dense layer of cold air sitting on above your line of sight. This is your classical water in the desert image. The opposite is superior mirage, where something appears higher than it should be. This is what the Air Force suggested happened. They also said a contributing factor to the sightings could have been the layer of smoke which hung over the area in a thin, stratiform layer. This smoke came from the forest fires in the area hung in the layer due to the stable conditions associated with the inversions. While the explanation on the surface is non-convincing and odd, research would soon reveal that it couldn't even be accurate. NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, would point out that the aforementioned stars couldn't be seen at the time. The Air Force responded by changing the star to be Capella, which was slightly above the eastern horizon at the time of the sighting. However, this doesn't explain the descent of the object witnessed that night by multiple people. Capella would have been rising and not falling. Furthermore, it doesn't explain the two objects meeting with one another. In addition, weather conditions that night don't show any evidence of a temperature inversion, which would lead one to see a mirage. Officer Carson was told a number of things that could have been the object, including weather balloons, the northern lights, and light refractions. Carson had this to say about the sighting. "I served 4 years with the Air Force. I believe I am familiar with the northern lights, also weather balloons. Both of us are aware of the tricks light can play on the eyes during darkness. We were aware of this at the time. Our observations and estimations of speed, size, etc. came from the aligning the object with fixed objects on the horizon. I agree we find it difficult to believe what we were watching, but no one will ever convince us that we were witnessing a refraction of light." It should also be mentioned that Scott was a paratrooper during the Korean War. So what can we conclude from this case? It appears that unless all the officers were making this story up, the explanation given by the military doesn't seem plausible. The officers followed the light, which moved in various directions. This was witnessed in different locations as well. One other thing to point out is that the next night, Officer Fry and others would spot these objects. They would be witnessed over the next several weeks. Also, we can conclude that if this story was true, it pretty much rules out any type of mirage or optical phenomenon. Mirages wouldn't be capable of ascending or descending. One final takeaway is that the officers appear credible and don't seem motivated by any sort of fame or financial compensation. We must remember, back then, alleging to see a flying saucer was a risky move and could lead to ridicule and often put people's career in jeopardy.